Do surveys sometimes intentionally alter the results? If an election takes place with a permanent poll, as is currently the case, or if the same election were held without anyone being able to know the opinions of other citizens, the result would certainly be different. Polls can have negative effects, as it becomes easier to influence a group of people. This phenomenon is sometimes called the science of the tipping point. It is the critical threshold of people who adopt a behavior, subsequently causing its adoption by the majority. How does science define a crowd? It is important to remember that in Mecca, the number of pilgrims can reach between 2 and 3 million. The accident occurs frequently at the same place, at the entrance of a bridge called Jamaraf. Because of a narrowing, people try to pass simultaneously, which increases the density until it reaches about 8 to 10 individuals per square meter. It's not a good sign. People are beginning to have trouble breathing. In the laboratory, among colleagues, we refer to this as a recurring phenomenon. It is essential to understand how the brain works. A specific rule called homophily. It is possible, to some extent, to predict which people will become your friends. When a person gains weight, a similar trend can be observed over the years among their friends. It's the same within a couple, isn't it? It's the same in a couple. What is it that ants manage to accomplish that we, as human beings, don't always manage to do? The division of tasks among ants is both complex and fascinating. It is a system of work distribution called stigmergy. Is there an aspect we could draw inspiration from? I didn't realize how much we depend on the people around us and on our social network. Sometimes we act according to our personality and our preferences. We tell ourselves, this is my way of being, this is how I act. But in reality, that's not the case at all. Is the majority always right? Yes, France is going through a difficult period, but you are not destined to suffer the same fate, for history proves it. We have noticed a small detail. More than 60% of the viewers of our videos have not yet subscribed to the channel. 60%, that's still quite considerable. Allow me to appeal to you. If you appreciate our work and wish to support us, subscribe now. In return, I commit to taking your feedback into account, inviting the best specialists, and continuing to offer a high-quality program. I am counting on your support. Many thanks to you. When one finds oneself caught in a crowd, one often feels a certain apprehension. What if, suddenly, the situation were to become uncontrollable? What is often overlooked is that crowd behavior belongs to a true science, influenced by our cognitive biases. To address this topic, I have invited one of the leading French experts in this field. Holder of a doctorate in behavioral sciences, researcher at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, and author of several works, he devotes his research to a question that is as simple as it is fascinating. What happens when a large number of people gather in the same place? He studies situations of panic, gatherings, and traffic jams, and highlights that behind the apparent disorganization, the crowd follows precise laws, guided by its own logic and sometimes a form of collective intelligence. We discover how a single emotion can spread to thousands of people in just a few seconds, why social networks intensify our collective dynamics, and what this reveals about human nature. Today, we are going to discuss science, psychology, and the way our minds interact with one another. Mehdi Moussaid, hello and welcome to the Manal Show. Hello Manal, thank you very much for the invitation. I am delighted to take part in your podcast today. My first question is simple. In your opinion, what is the biggest mistake people make during a crowd movement that particularly annoys you? That is an excellent question, because I have had the opportunity to analyze many crowd movements, including incidents and crushes occurring, for example, during religious pilgrimages, music festivals, on public transportation, or in concert halls. And as part of my work, I unfortunately have to watch these videos in order to analyze them. It is not easy to watch, because you see people in distress, sometimes in situations that put their lives in danger. And it is true that, sometimes, when watching these videos, I observe certain individual behaviors that affect me emotionally, because I realize that they are not the appropriate reactions to have. Thus, I believe that what affects or irritates me the most are the people who venture into areas that present risks. In reality, many people do not necessarily realize that a crowd can present a certain danger, don't they? When you are part of a crowd, you become a simple element within a large whole, not always aware of what is happening around you. In reality, what we often wish to do is to get closer. For example, at a festival, we try to move nearer to the stage, or during a pilgrimage, to reach the place of contemplation, and so on. And we do not always understand why access is blocked, why there is such a large crowd, so we try to make our way through. And when I see people trying to make their way through while, a little farther away, others are in great distress, it deeply moves me, because I feel like stepping into the video and saying, "Stop, don't go any further, don't try to make your way through, it's dangerous, you're facing a serious risk ahead of you." In reality, people do not always realize the level of danger that this represents. The public does not perceive that a crowd can actually be a source of risk. A crowd is nothing more than a group of people, and even when there are huge numbers of them, we often go without hesitation. Yet, it can actually present a real danger. And when people try to make their way through, it is as if they were deliberately moving toward a place where their safety would be seriously threatened. And that troubles me deeply. When you, Mehdi, observe this crowd movement, are you able to recognize that the situation is deteriorating and that it may lead to a serious incident? And if that is the case, in what way does it show itself? For this, we use very precise measuring tools. One of the most useful indicators is density. Density corresponds to the number of people present per square meter. In other words, it indicates how limited the space between individuals is. In reality, it is a reference scale commonly used in the scientific study of crowds. It is known, for example, that in everyday life, when you walk down the street, the density is very low, generally less than 1 person per square meter. In other words, there is enough space around you to walk at your usual pace without any difficulty. When you are in the subway or in a shopping mall on a Saturday afternoon, the density can reach about 1 person per square meter. It's not a very high density, but it simply becomes uncomfortable because there are quite a few people and you have to weave your way between them. It is possible to reach a density of 3 to 4 people per square meter, as can happen in a subway car during a strike, when passengers are very close to one another. In this case, a density of 3 to 4 people per square meter is reached. It is not dangerous, even though it remains quite uncomfortable. From what point does it start to pose a real danger? Indeed, starting from a density of about 6 people per square meter, individuals begin to come into close contact, which leads to the emergence of a particular physical phenomenon. In reality, bodies transmit pressure. When a person moves slightly to the right, they push their neighbor in the same direction, who in turn passes this movement on to the next person, and so on. This causes a kind of wave of movements and successive shifts that passes through the crowd. This phenomenon occurs when the density reaches about 6 people per square meter. At this point, the situation becomes risky because the pressure within the crowd increases significantly. The highest densities observed generally reach 7, 8, or 9 people per square meter and can rise to 10 in some cases. One can easily imagine the situation. In a space of 1 square meter, 10 people are grouped together, and this density extends across the entire site. Could you give us an example of a situation where such a density of people per square meter was observed and where conditions deteriorated? We studied 2 specific situations in which the density reached about 10 people per square meter. The first example concerns a music festival, the Love Parade, which took place in Duisburg, Germany, in 2010. 21 people lost their lives, and all the footage from the surveillance cameras was then collected for analysis. The surveillance cameras were ideally positioned to allow the researchers to carry out their analyses. Indeed, the density reached such a high level that it exceeded what the human body can reasonably withstand. The second situation concerns several videos from the Great Pilgrimage to Mecca, an event often subject to crowd movements due to the exceptionally high density of participants. Mehdi, apart from the pilgrimage to Mecca, which served as a case study for you and which we will analyze together, we will discuss in more detail the research and work that you and your colleagues have carried out on this subject, as it is particularly interesting. Of course, I have prepared several questions about this, but before that, which gatherings have you identified as presenting the highest risks? In general, three main factors can be distinguished that bring together the largest crowds. The first factor is of a spiritual nature. Spiritual gatherings are generally the events that attract the largest crowds and are of the greatest interest for our studies. The second factor of attraction is celebration, such as festivals, New Year's parties, or other festive events of this kind. There are many gatherings in public spaces that can present risks, such as the incident that occurred in Seoul during the Halloween celebrations. The third factor of attraction concerns sporting events, particularly football. That's exactly what I was thinking. We also observe the largest gatherings around football stadiums or during celebrations following a victory or similar events. With these three types of gatherings, have you noticed a common characteristic? Yes, there are many things in common. In reality, the same phenomenon occurs each time. In reality, it would be more relevant to look for the differences, as they are rare. Indeed, when one reaches such a level of density, the reason for the gathering ultimately loses its importance. In other words, whether you are taking part in a music festival with a festive atmosphere, a football supporter heading to the stadium, or someone motivated by a spiritual journey going to a place of worship, as part of a ritual. In reality, when the crowd is dense, nothing really changes. It simply depends on the laws of physics. We make extensive use of the tools of physics. We translate all of this into equations, and the religious or festive aspect in no way plays a role in our models. This changes nothing. It is simply a system governed by physics. But before going any further, what is a crowd from a scientific point of view? What is the precise definition that allows us to fully grasp its meaning? In fact, there are several definitions depending on the field or aspect being studied. It is a group bringing together a large number of individuals, thus forming a collective system. This system is characterized by its decentralized organization. No leader determines the direction or movements of each person. Each individual acts freely and is influenced only by those around them. With such a definition, one is concerned not only with crowds as we usually imagine them, but also with other remarkable collective forms, such as schools of fish or flocks of birds. This too corresponds to crowds, in the scientific sense of the term. For example, one can imagine a huge school of sardines moving through the ocean, gathering millions or even hundreds of millions of individuals. The whole system works in a completely decentralized way. No leader intervenes. Each fish adapts its behavior based on that of its neighbors. And when one steps back to observe the whole, one can make out magnificent aquatic choreographies, yet no fish is deliberately trying to swim that way. Each simply reacts to its neighbors. Thus, that is also part of the definition. There are also crowds of internet users, which we may talk about later, and which are also part of the definition. A group of individuals operating in a decentralized way, no leader is present, and each acts according to the behavior of their neighbors. Very well. Which discovery surprised you the most during your research? When I started out as a young doctoral student on this subject, I thought it was mainly a matter of the humanities, psychology, and social sciences. In fact, I was very surprised to find that it was largely a matter of physics. In reality, when one seeks to model or describe a crowd using scientific tools, models derived from physics, particularly those used in fluid mechanics, prove to be the most effective and can be applied to human gatherings. This means that a liquid flowing through a pipe behaves, to some extent, in a similar way to a crowd moving along a street. Thus, one somehow loses a part of humanity and individuality because of the massive nature of the group. In reality, when one finds oneself in the midst of a large crowd, one may have certain personal intentions or thoughts, for example saying to oneself, that seems dangerous. In reality, it doesn't change anything at all, since in any case it is impossible to move. We are simply carried along by the movement of our neighbors, and in this sense, it strongly evokes a physical system in which each particle is influenced by those surrounding it. What surprised me most, in fact, was the lack of a human dimension in the models we use. It is mainly a matter of physics, exact sciences, and disciplines based on inert phenomena. At first, I was quite astonished, almost philosophically disturbed, when I realized that my own behavior could ultimately be represented by an equation. It's a bit as if I were completely predictable, and in fact, that's how the mechanism works. However, I find that you bring, on the contrary, a genuine human dimension. There is a dimension related to cognitive sciences, where one seeks to understand how people act, what information they retain, and so on. However, this aspect really has an effect only in low-density contexts, when the space is less crowded, because that is where freedom of action is greater. One can therefore try to anticipate the direction people will take based on their intentions or motivations. However, when the system becomes extremely dense and space becomes very limited, these differences no longer really matter. On September 24, 2015, a tragic stampede occurred during the pilgrimage to Mecca, resulting in the deaths of more than 2,000 people. What happened that day? I pause briefly in this interview to ask you an essential question. Have you ever searched for your own name on Google? Well, you'd be surprised to see everything that can come up about you. And honestly, it can be quite unsettling. We do not always realize the extent to which our personal information is spread on the internet. Your name, phone number, email address, and sometimes even your mailing address can be shared by websites you have never heard of. The most concerning thing is that this information can be used to steal your identity. It's precisely at that moment that Enhancement, the partner of this video, comes into play. Enhancement is a service that automatically removes your personal information from the internet. In short, you become practically impossible to find. The operating method is very simple. In addition to automatic deletions, it is also possible to perform custom deletions. Have you spotted information that you would like to have removed? Copy the link, paste it into your Enhancement dashboard, click Submit, and Enhancement will remove the information without delay. No endless forms, no complex procedure. A simple copy and paste is all it takes to regain full control of your personal data. Nowadays, sharing one's private life online has become inevitable, and Enhancement offers the possibility of doing so in just a few seconds. So act now. Take back control of your personal information with Enhancement. And for you, an exceptional offer. Enjoy 60% off the annual subscription with the code MANALCHUD by following the link provided in the description, enhancement.com/MANALCHUD. A big thank you to Enhancement for their support in this video. What you need to know about the MCC is that it is a religious pilgrimage organized every year. There is a very large number of pilgrims, about 2 to 3 million, who perform the same rites simultaneously. This naturally causes large gatherings of people and, consequently, presents certain risks. In reality, the MCC was largely inaccessible to researchers and scientific observers from the 1990s until 2006. Starting in 2006, researchers, not me personally, began going to the site to make video recordings and try to understand the causes of these incidents. Starting in 2006, the incident stopped. Indeed, the researchers made discoveries and implemented measures that made it possible to considerably reduce these events. Since 2006, only one incident has occurred, the one in 2015, unfortunately, because zero risk does not exist. What is particularly interesting is to understand precisely what happened over all those years, as well as in 2015. Several risk factors tend to accumulate. The crowd is particularly dense, exceeding 6 people per square meter. Yes, you had raised the question of density. Exactly. The incident occurs very frequently at the same place, at the entrance of the bridge called Jamarat. This bridge actually causes a bottleneck, in other words, a narrowing of the traffic. In other words, the crowd arrives via a wide avenue, then moves toward the entrance of the bridge, which is narrower. It is therefore inevitable that people will crowd together slightly to get onto the bridge. It was at the entrance of this bridge that most of the incidents occurred. There is an excessive crowd, a narrow passage, and people are trying to enter it simultaneously. The density of the crowd increases, reaching about 8 to 10 people per square meter. People then have difficulty breathing, which leads to tragic losses. There are therefore two major factors: the high density and the narrowing of the passage. The narrowing, which we call among colleagues in the laboratory the Votre narrowing, is considered a major risk factor. Whenever serious incidents occur, a narrowing is usually observed at the end of the street. As you mentioned, several researchers have analyzed this case, which is now regarded as a reference example. I would like to know what measures have been implemented to prevent this type of crowd surge in the future. This partly relates to the various risk factors that I mentioned earlier. For example, the first measure introduced consisted of setting up one-way traffic lanes. These are pedestrian paths, but one-way, which means that passers-by can move only in a single direction. And if he has forgotten something and wants to go back, he is not allowed to do. He must continue to the end, cross at the intersection, then take the parallel road to move in the opposite direction. Thus, only one-way streets are put in place, since two-way traffic presents an increased risk, on the one hand. On the other hand, very strict regulations have been put in place regarding passage times. Previously, the situation was more flexible and somewhat disorganized, since each pilgrim could go there at any time, which created great uncertainty about the number of participants. Obviously, most people go there at the same time because we share a similar biological rhythm. We wake up, have a meal, and then set off. Starting in 2006, pilgrims were given entry tickets indicating a specific time, allowing them to access it only at that moment, in order to avoid excessive crowds. This thus makes it possible to regulate the flow of people. Next, we find the well-known narrow passages, accompanied by two major adjustments. The first peculiarity is that these narrowings are not always visible. For example, a common mistake was to park an ambulance by the side of the road in case an accident occurred. But in reality, the presence of the ambulance causes a narrowing because it occupies part of the available space. Thus, the available space shrinks, forcing the crowd to go around the ambulance. This creates a narrowing that one had not noticed before. In reality, the ambulance should not be parked in that spot, because in that position it poses more risks than it provides help. Thus, we cleared the space in this way. There were also many tired pilgrims who lay down directly on the road to rest, for example. This caused small groups of pilgrims to gather along the sides of the road, once again leading to a narrowing of the space. From now on, it is prohibited. One must go to the zones specifically designated for that purpose. There is also the well-known narrowing of the Jamarat Bridge, the one mentioned earlier, where no further intervention is possible because the space is naturally limited. However, it has been enlarged several times, at many successive stages. Today, when you look at this bridge in photos, it no longer even looks like a bridge, it rather suggests a vast complex, comparable to an airport, so immense it is, with several levels and numerous access ramps designed to allow the simultaneous movement of a large number of people. These are the different transformations that have been carried out. Before the developments, up until 2006, an average of one incident was recorded every 3 years. Since the changes, only one occurred in 2015. We can therefore say that these measures have had a positive impact, even if the situation is not yet completely under control. That's exactly the question I was going to ask you, because in the end, many improvements have been implemented. What is the aspect that still escapes control and that researchers have not yet fully managed to master? That is an excellent question. It falls within the science of complex systems, which remains largely unpredictable. You know, it's a bit like weather forecasting. Exactly, that's absolutely right. It's comparable to the weather, with those butterfly effect phenomena and minimal influences that can lead to major changes. In meteorology, it is possible to forecast the weather for the coming days up to 3 or 4 days in advance, but beyond a week, the forecasts become too uncertain. Even when we have cloud mapping and observe their movements, it remains difficult to predict their development precisely. Why? Because in reality, every tiny detail can intensify over 3 or 4 days, making any precise forecast of its evolution impossible. In meteorology, there is a limit to the accuracy of forecasts. Beyond a certain point, it becomes impossible to go further in prediction. To anticipate the behavior of a crowd, the same principle applies. It follows dynamics comparable to those of other complex systems. From a mathematical point of view, the phenomenon is similar. A butterfly effect occurs, making precise predictions very difficult because every tiny detail can considerably influence the whole. Most of the time, details matter little, but sometimes a single one of them triggers a chain reaction, producing an unexpected effect that disrupts the system's balance. That's exactly it. The principle is identical to that of meteorology. Based on your research, do you think it would be advisable to set a limit on the number of pilgrims each year to prevent such incidents from happening again? And if that is the case, could you specify what approximate number would best ensure the safety of the pilgrims? The number of pilgrims is indeed limited due to the potential risks that this may entail. This restriction is already regulated by the authorities of Saudi Arabia. This number nevertheless remains very significant, lying between 2 and 3 million people. The maximum number reached about 3 million participants, and in fact, the pilgrimage organization wishes to welcome as many worshippers as possible. This simply requires new infrastructure, which means they are constantly carrying out reconstruction and improvement work. They are continually working on expanding the site in order to accommodate an even greater number of pilgrims. In reality, there is an actual selection process to be admitted as a pilgrim to Mecca. Although some entries may escape supervision, the overall process remains generally well regulated. I could not give the exact number, as it depends heavily on the capacity and condition of the infrastructure. Currently, there are roughly between 2 and 2.5 million participants. It remains manageable, even though the crowd density is still significant. That also depends on the criteria taken into account. Is it a criterion related to vital safety or rather to comfort when traveling? At this level, the risk to life is relatively well controlled thanks to the limit set at around 2.5 to 3 million participants. As for walking comfort, it is not guaranteed at all. The participants find themselves very close to one another, without, however, reaching a systematic level of danger every year. I cannot give a precise figure, but it is clear that a limitation is necessary, and it is already in place. Are you still pursuing your research on pilgrimage as a subject of study? For my part, I no longer devote myself to the study of pilgrimage, having broadened my work to other areas of research. However, some researchers continue to go there every year. We remain committed to a process of continuous improvement, seeking to make progress year after year. Yes, I think we will remain in a phase of continuous improvement for some time yet. I would like to know what the first thing to look out for is when you find yourself in a very crowded place. Because, Mehdi, it's something that really makes me anxious. With time and the passing years, I feel that my reluctance to go to very crowded places is growing stronger. These are truly apprehensions and worries that arise within me. Could you give us some advice on how to avoid finding ourselves in the middle of a moving crowd? To identify high-risk places. In reality, the best thing to do is to identify potentially dangerous areas in order to avoid them. Because once you find yourself caught up in a crowd movement, it becomes very difficult to get out of it, as you have the feeling of being trapped. So that's an excellent question you're raising, Manal. How can we spot in advance the moment when we have to say to ourselves, all right, I'll stop here and turn back? In reality, the first criterion to take into account is density. However, it is difficult to assess this density simply by eye. Among the little practical tips, one can mention, for example, the act of unintentionally brushing against 2 people at the same time. Thus, if you find yourself in a crowd and feel 2 physical contacts at the same time, for example, one person on one side and another on the other, both very close to you, it indicates a density higher than about 4 or 5 people per square meter. You can then tell yourself, well, the space is starting to tighten up. Subsequently, another criterion comes into play, since there are actually several risk factors. Another important criterion concerns the presence of bidirectional flows. Some people move in one direction, while others move in the opposite direction in the same corridor. It is a criterion that is frequently observed, and it is generally not a good sign. We'll talk about it again later, but in general, when adjustments are made, the flow of traffic is organized in a single direction. Thus, if you find yourself in an already very crowded space and people are moving in both directions, for example, in a subway corridor with some exiting and others entering, the situation becomes rather uncomfortable. A third possible risk factor is the presence of a bottleneck. It is an almost systematic phenomenon. For example, a corridor or a street may gradually narrow. When space shrinks, density naturally rises as the same number of people fit into less room, making the environment more compact. Problem situations likely to escalate often arise where the space narrows. Right, using the metro as an example, you note that this occurs when passenger flows move in both directions. If I must take the metro with no other option, how should I behave to minimize crowd movement and stay safe? The first tip is to assess the situation and stop moving, but if that step was missed and you're already in the crowd center, then you catch yourself thinking, I feel uneasy and want to turn back. In fact, turning back is impossible, as you're completely trapped in the crowd. So, how can we reduce the risk? First, avoid losing your balance. Easy to say, but in reality, incidents often end in a fall. In other words, people are packed so closely that if one person stumbles, their fall triggers a chain reaction, causing others to lose balance and fall in a domino effect. This was notably seen during a crowd surge in Seoul a few years ago that left over 150 dead, a particularly tragic event. It was a particularly tragic event during a Halloween celebration. You may have heard about it. Yes, I remember it well. The people were packed closely together in an unusually narrow street. One person lost balance, triggering a chain reaction that caused others to fall, and in such situations, it's usually very hard for them to get back up. In reality, they couldn't get up because they lost their lives under the crowd's pressure. Avoiding a fall seems simple in theory, but it's far harder in practice. However, one can make extra effort to stay balanced by watching where they step and similar details. For example, at a festival, bags or other items often end up on the ground, so people watch where they step. Another point to note is the crowd surges, like waves of jostling, spreading through everyone present. At some point, these waves of motion will reach you. You'll feel still for a while, then suddenly be swept sideways. Seen from above, it's simply a collective wave of jostling spreading from person to person until it reaches you. At that moment, the motion gently shifts you before continuing naturally. Stay alert to avoid losing balance at that moment. Another key tip: don't fight the group's flow, alright? If the crowd moves right and you push back, you'll only intensify the collective motion, making the next surge even stronger. When a wave of motion hits you, it's like being caught in an ocean current. When a wave comes, it's best to move with it rather than resist. If the crowd pushes you one way, take small sideways steps to stay balanced, move with the flow, and wait calmly as it shifts back and settles. In truly exceptional cases, when the crowd becomes extremely dense, serious incidents can sadly occur, with many lives at risk, mainly due to lack of oxygen. It's not always something you notice right away. The main danger comes from lack of air. When the crowd grows too dense, breathing becomes hard, leading to fainting and life-threatening risks. It could indeed be a good option. It's sometimes advised to cross your arms over your chest for light pressure and better stability. Leave a small space to keep breathing properly. This is the position to take in extreme cases when breathing becomes hard, but don't worry, Manal, it should never happen to you or anyone else. I truly hope so. It's a very distressing, though thankfully rare, situation and the safety position to use only as a last resort. Place both fists like this, bring them together, and position them at the center of the chest. A bit like a boxer assuming a guard stance in this exact position. The goal is simply to create a small space under pressure so breathing remains possible. Great. There's another topic I find truly fascinating: traffic jams. One event especially surprised us: a massive traffic jam on Monday, October 6, 2025, near the Yuzhuang toll station in China, that stranded over 120,000 drivers for nearly 36 hours. Needless to say, it was a real nightmare for me. What really happened that day? That day, two events occurred simultaneously, drawing a large crowd. I no longer recall exactly what those two events were. It was likely the start of school holidays and a national holiday in China, which explained the unusually large crowds. Every driver knows what happens at a toll. It's familiar to anyone who takes the wheel. You pay, the lane narrows, and once that's done, all vehicles merge to continue on their way. That's exactly what we mentioned about crowds. The road narrows, and with heavy traffic, density rises. When many people or vehicles pass through a small space, a jam forms. It's inevitable, exactly what we've seen so far. No scientific surprises, known risk factors appear together, producing the expected outcomes. In this case, there's no crowding, since it involves drivers, not pedestrians. They won't rush or pack together as people on foot might. Instead, they wait in their cars, stuck in traffic jams that last a very long time. We once again faced that cursed, highly troublesome bottleneck. Why do we sometimes see a sudden, sharp slowdown on the road? You know, when driving through a slowdown, we often realize there was nothing special, just a pause or a delay without any clear reason. There will be a slight slowdown somewhere, but it was much farther ahead. In fact, once you're moving again, you're no longer where the slowdown began. In fact, a highway slowdown can stem from something trivial, like a minor incident in the opposite lane briefly distracting drivers and making them ease off before resuming normal speed. In reality, each following vehicle slows down in turn, and the pattern continues down the line. Then the first cars speed up again, and though the slowdown seems to stop there, it actually keeps moving backward. You see what I mean? There's an accordion-like effect, where slowed or briefly stopped vehicles gradually shift backward. So when you finally stop, you may be 2 kilometers past the slowdown's cause, and by the time you move again, it's all cleared up. In fact, it's simply the slowdown that has gradually shifted backward. The same effect appears among pedestrians, especially during large gatherings like the Hajj in Mecca. When a flow of people moves along a street and a brief slowdown occurs, those behind stop in turn, triggering a chain reaction. The first keep moving, but the slowdown gradually spreads backward in a way. This phenomenon is called the accordion effect, or in English, the stop-and-go effect. When you pass and slow down slightly, it's only a small drop in speed. But for the driver behind, the slowdown is stronger, and even more so for the next, until it causes sudden braking 50 meters later and a major traffic jam farther down the road. But it's exactly the same dynamic, only in reverse, that I was telling you about. Interestingly, crowd movement research largely began with traffic studies in the 1990s. In the 1990s, my future thesis advisor specialized in traffic studies. He later turned his focus to pedestrians and hired me as a PhD student about 10 years later. Indeed, research often began with studies of car traffic. What specific advice could help prevent this kind of traffic jam? When driving, what should you do? Our simulations show that keeping a steady speed is most effective. There's no doubt about it. The real issue is the constant shift between light acceleration, slight slowing, and repeated braking. In fact, if someone averages 50 kilometers per hour but constantly shifts between 70, 20, 30, and 60 kilometers per hour, this inconsistency ends up causing heavy traffic. However, if the same vehicles move steadily at 50 kilometers per hour, traffic flows smoothly and the destination is reached much faster. In short, the goal is to minimize speed changes and maintain steady driving. Actually, I'm wondering about self-driving vehicles. In that case, wouldn't it make sense to introduce autonomous vehicles like modern models that can keep a constant speed? Absolutely, that would be the ideal situation. When we run our models and simulations, we study unlikely scenarios solely to observe their behavior in theory. In this type of simulation, we can adjust parameters to assume all vehicles move at the same speed, closely spaced, accelerating in sync. It's a somewhat idealized scenario, unrealistic in practice since cars would be too close to travel at 50, 60, or 80 kilometers per hour. But it's ideal, a continuous flow that lets people arrive much faster. No traffic jams and the like, now possible thanks to autonomous vehicles. If only self-driving cars were on the highway, they'd move much like train cars in a line. In other words, each moves at the same speed without touching the others. That would be ideal. So, could self-driving cars be the answer to traffic jams? Yes, but other constraints will likely emerge later. Technically, a self-driving car is a highly effective way to ease traffic jams. Excellent. Your expertise extends well beyond crowd dynamics, as you also explore cognitive biases, a particularly fascinating topic. So my question is, why does our brain so enjoy agreeing with the majority? Our brain indeed likes to align with the majority. Why? Simply because it's a cognitive bias. It's crucial to understand how the brain works, as it essentially operates at two speeds. Part of our brain is devoted to deep reasoning. It analyzes, focuses, and engages real mental effort. For example, solving a slightly complex multiplication would require deeper thought and engage your core reasoning. In everyday life, when we react or make decisions, we don't always use deep reflection. Instead, we rely on fast thinking that helps us decide spontaneously. This fast thinking mode uses strategies and mental shortcuts to boost efficiency while minimizing errors. One such mechanism, called cognitive bias, involves following the behavior or choices of the majority. Unconsciously, our brain learns through experience and habit that following others often offers answers with little effort. For example, when you get off the train and don't want to check all the signs, a simple way is to watch where other travelers go and follow them. They'll usually lead you naturally to the exit. Imagine you want to buy a new phone, with many brands available online. With so many models to choose from, you can look at the ones your friends have for guidance. Even if you pick the same model, it might not be the best, but it will still be a good choice. When choosing a restaurant or movie, you can often save time by simply following others' choices. I must admit, this approach works well. By copying others, we simply minimize our effort. It's partly laziness, a tendency toward ease. In fact, it's not about laziness. In fact, it's an evolutionary trait of the brain. Those who decide quickly were more likely to survive. That applies less today, but it's easy to imagine. It's a kind of reasoning many animals use in nature. They follow others, believing it's safer not to take risks. One can easily picture a herd of gazelles in the savannah watching one suddenly flee. If a gazelle thinks, I won't follow her, I'll check for danger first, maybe she's wrong. By the time it does, it's too late. It becomes the predator's prey. In truth, the instinct is to think, if she flees, I will too. It likely increases my chances of survival. And it works well. It's not laziness, but actually an effective approach. But this strategy mainly benefited our distant ancestors. In this context, can we truly think independently within a crowd? How does the group shape our thinking? Yes, the group exerts a strong influence, often without our awareness. Sometimes we act based on our personality and preferences, saying, that's just how I am. In reality, not at all. Absolutely not. In fact, not at all. Fascinating research from the early 2000s analyzed people's social networks and friendships to study their thinking, daily behaviors, diets, sleep, and lifestyle choices. Their physical activity, sports habits, and so on. We observe a kind of behavioral influence, where we often mirror our friends' actions, who in turn imitate those of their own friends, and so on. For instance, a large-scale study was conducted in a small American town called Framingham. It's a small town of about 50,000 to 100,000 residents, where everyone has taken part for decades in a long-term scientific study. At regular intervals, about every month or so, participants report their friendships, coworkers, family members, and other social connections. This helps reveal the social network structure of the small town and provides a complete overview, while participants also share various personal details. Do you eat meat, smoke, and what is your current weight? Do you sleep well and feel more sad or happy? Over several decades, one sees that certain trends spread over time. For example, changes in body weight are strongly shaped by our social circle, especially neighbors and friends. When someone gains weight, their body mass index, BMI, rises accordingly. In the following years, a similar trend appears among his friends and acquaintances. In the following years, the same pattern appears in the couple's relationship, doesn't it? Yes, exactly. It's similar in married life. It's a similar dynamic within couples, though it appears more pronounced between people of the same gender. When a man gains weight, he usually has a stronger influence on another man than on a woman. Similarly, a woman tends to influence another woman more than a man. Certain eating habits that promote weight gain can easily spread from one person to another. For example, if you start running a little each day, it will not only benefit your body, but may also inspire your friends, and even their friends, to take up exercise too. You'll also bring positive effects to those around you, showing the importance of surrounding yourself wisely and choosing friends carefully. Although we can't always choose our friends or surroundings, well-known social attraction principles help predict who we're most likely to form friendships with. One such rule, called homophily, describes the tendency of people to befriend those similar to themselves. It may sound self-centered, but if you meet someone at a party or work who shares your tastes, background, or personality, you'll naturally find them likable and likely form a friendship. In fact, you find this person likable mainly because they resemble you. The same principle applies to everyone, so it's somewhat possible to predict who will become friends. Thus, the saying that we endure our family, but choose our friends isn't entirely accurate. Not really. I'd say that birds of a feather flock together reflects reality much better. If your friends are overweight, you're more likely to be as well, and the opposite can also be true. If I work to improve my fitness, my friends are likely to do this. Spending time with a friend who makes an effort will inspire and positively influence me. Absolutely, it's obvious. The smoking example clearly illustrates it. All our data on smoking are remarkably clear. Smokers often have friends who smoke, while non-smokers mostly associate with other non-smokers, and this pattern spreads easily. If one person in a group starts smoking, another is likely to follow in the coming years. Today, the trend is mostly reversed. When people quit smoking, they spark a wave of quitting among their friends and beyond. Even more striking is mood, the feeling of being happy or unhappy. These factors are contagious. Being around fulfilled people gradually boosts your own well-being as their positivity influences you. The reverse is also true, as these effects are evident in everyday life. Then can we shape our mind by surrounding ourselves with people whose traits or behavior we wish to adopt? You can always try surrounding yourself with people who inspire you. They must also choose to include you. The relationship has to be mutual. From a strictly rational standpoint, you could devise a plan or strategy, and so on. But such methods are not very effective for influencing how your own mind works. Indeed, you can choose people around you whom you're not very close to but admire and wish to draw inspiration from. You could also make an effort to spend a bit more time with these people. It might have a mildly positive effect. At this point, I'm simply making a guess. So, how can one break free from group influence? Try to recognize these biases and make the effort, each time, to decide independently. However, it's not really necessary to completely reject collective influence. Collective influence can also be positive, revealing trends you might not notice on your own. It may have drawbacks, but also positive sides and can even be useful to some extent. As I mentioned, collective influence can also have its pitfalls. For instance, a false alarm during panic can trigger a crowd to start running. In this case, it's hard to know if running too is truly wise. It's an open question with no clear answer. Whether to resist collective influence depends on the situation. That's the real question. Today, we live in a society that puts great value on numbers. That's how credibility is often judged. For instance, a YouTube channel's value is usually measured by its subscriber count. When a movie is a box office hit, we often assume it must be good. The same goes for a president elected by a majority, seen as the best collective choice. So, does the majority always get it right? Simply put, no, it doesn't necessarily mean they're right. She may be right or not, depending on the circumstances. It's interesting, as majority effects are well studied in collective intelligence. You might think, I have a problem to solve and a large group before me. If I just let them vote and pick the majority answer, will that work better than choosing at random or relying on the most competent person? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. At first, we conducted these experiments using very simple tasks, such as logic or spatial reasoning exercises. We began questioning participants using the Raven logic test on spatial geometry, which we used for our observations. It's a demanding test. The first questions are easy, but the last ones are much harder. When taken individually, success rates average around 60 to 65%. If you test many people, each scores about 65% on average. But if you have them vote, will the group's collective answer be right? And in this case, the result is excellent. It nearly reaches 100%. Thus, voting proves highly effective for solving logic problems. However, it would be premature to assume voting works flawlessly or suits every situation. Well, actually, no. For instance, if we apply the same voting principle but use a general knowledge test to evaluate participants, it suddenly stops working. You can't settle a general knowledge test by vote. Trick questions would fool the majority right away, wouldn't they? In fact, we carry this out very rigorously in the lab. For example, we give participants general knowledge quizzes and then ask them to vote. They all get tricked. For instance, when asked Côte d'Ivoire's capital, most vote for Abidjan, which is wrong. When asked Switzerland's capital, most people choose Zurich, Lausanne, or Geneva. That's not correct. For South Africa's capital, many people say Johannesburg, among others. That's not the case. Why is that? Most people get it wrong every time. In fact, the majority helps correct small individual mistakes. Thus, when many people err differently, as in a logic test, each follows a slightly distinct reasoning. In fact, by removing these errors and keeping only the complementary insights, one can reach the correct answer. However, when something appealing like Abidjan, the capital of Côte d'Ivoire, catches attention, most people are easily misled. Likewise, in politics, as you just mentioned, a demagogic figure is a particularly powerful attractor. In other words, making promises without intending to keep them can be a highly effective way to win votes. It's much like Abidjan, the capital of Côte d'Ivoire, a false landmark, a real trap in which most people often get caught. Alright, then why do people choose to vote? Do they vote more for image, personality, or promises than for real achievements? Are you speaking about politics? Yes. When it comes to politics, I'm not entirely sure. Several factors come into play at once. The candidate's personality is likely one of them. It's probably partly about the platform, but mainly about promises and similar commitments, I think. Alright, my question may be a bit philosophical, but I'd really like your personal view on this. Do you think it's wise to let the majority decide? Sorry, in what exact context? For instance, take elections. In politics, do we let the majority decide simply because we already live in a democracy? Yes. Do you think it's a wise decision? Yes, it's a good idea. Alternatives would be authoritarian regimes. Where exactly is she trying to lead me? The real question is whether democracy is a good idea. Yes, mainly because alternative models lead to authoritarian regimes where power rests with one person or a small elite. In the late 19th century, people debated whether to rely on the aristocracy or move toward a democratic model. It marked the dawn of collective intelligence, when people questioned whether decisions should rest with a few educated leaders or be made by popular vote. Majority voting, regardless of its accuracy, has one key advantage: it involves everyone. I often explain this when working with teams who ask if it's worthwhile to have all employees vote on certain decisions. Yes, that's a great example. The answer is mixed. Voting works for logic tests, but fails for general knowledge ones. Regardless of its success, its main strength lies in engaging people. In business, for instance, involving employees in a vote fosters positivity, even if the final decision isn't ideal. This will have a positive effect, fostering cohesion as participants feel they made the decision together. It truly creates a sense of social identity, a concept known as social identity. This aspect is crucial as it fosters cohesion. In that sense, it's already positive. Voting matters, but it must be implemented in the most suitable way. There is the simple majority principle, which means consulting everyone and choosing the option with the most support. I could strengthen the majority decision through a confidence vote, asking each person's opinion and their certainty level, for example on a scale of 1 to 10. Each time, I'll adjust their answer based on their confidence level. This approach yields a more nuanced majority, giving greater weight to confident or expert individuals. This method works quite well. Many other voting approaches can assign varying weight to participants based on their profile, experience, or knowledge, among other factors. Each time, the level of effectiveness may differ. There are truly many voting methods, likely dozens. Some of these methods prove more effective than others. Organizing a presidential election can get complicated when voting methods are too elaborate. It might yield better results. In fact, I'm sure they would be much stronger. For example, in an election, polls can have a negative influence. It's evident in many areas. When voting, knowing others' views beforehand can influence you to adjust your own position. Thus, one can get drawn into a dynamic that becomes either a vicious or a virtuous circle around a specific choice. Can polls affect the results? The word manipulate implies deliberate intent, whereas polls can certainly distort or steer results. In other words, if an election is held with ongoing polling, as it is now, and compared to one where no one knows others' opinions until the final results, I can assure you the outcome would be different. That's why we're constantly bombarded with polls before every election. In fact, it would be better to suspend them during that time. I don't think polls are driven by a desire to influence, but by simple curiosity to know the result before it's officially announced. I'm not entirely sure, Mehdi. I'm still hesitant. That's my view anyway. Out of curiosity, we want to know the results in advance, which explains the polls, without always realizing they can have negative effects. And when we see which kinds of people or profiles were surveyed, it offers a completely different perspective. We realize the results don't always accurately represent the entire population. Generally, surveys are carefully conducted. But that's another matter. When well designed, they usually represent reality accurately. So, is it easier to influence a group or individuals separately? It's usually easier to influence a group, as collective dynamics create momentum and we tend to follow those around us. By starting the first movement, others can be drawn to follow, and such momentum can arise almost anywhere. With an individual who resists, their reaction is hard to predict. Generally, group behavior is more predictable than in individuals. So how does it work, and how can we influence group dynamics? Social influence is generally a powerful force. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon H. conducted the first social psychology studies on influence, asking groups seemingly simple questions like judging a line's length. There's a short line and a longer one, and the task is simply to say which is which seems very easy. However, some group members are in on it. They deliberately give the wrong answer and speak first. You're part of this group and instantly see the right answer, it's option B. The others all answer that it's option A. When your turn comes, you hesitate, surprised, you were sure the right answer was B. At that moment, social pressure suddenly sets in. Will you answer like most people or stick to your view and say B? Usually most choose A. Why does this happen? What's going on inside our brain? Do we fear exclusion? Do we dread making a mistake? What's really happening? Two forces are at play. The first is conformity. In other words, we feel safe agreeing with the majority because it keeps us from standing out. So, nothing sets me apart. I won't draw attention to myself. No one will question or demand explanations from me. In the end, I'm left in peace. If I speak like everyone else, they leave me alone. It's a conformist effect, but there's also a real influence that makes us think we're wrong. So if everyone says it's A and I think it's B, when it's my turn I'll think, all right, I was probably wrong. Either I misread or misunderstood the instructions, which in fact makes us question our own judgment. In this case, it's not just fear-based conformity, one truly changes their opinion. We conclude, no, it must be A, so I think it really is A. Then, if you ask me, I'll say, well, I think it was A. In a case of conformity, if I ask you again later when you're alone, you keep your original answer. In a case of social influence, if I ask you again later when you're alone, you take the group's answer, saying it was probably right, showing you've changed your opinion. I believe social influence is a truly powerful tool. Absolutely, it's everywhere in society and often hard to grasp or control. We're deeply shaped by those around us. It guides our lives and actions. I even feel it shapes our daily routines. That's what we were discussing earlier: smoking, weight gain, and well-being, all shaped, in some way, by social influence. Yes, our free will is quite limited, as we rely heavily on the social context we live in. So Mehdi, imagine I'm in a stadium, about to watch my two favorite teams as the match is about to start. To liven things up, I feel like starting a wave. So, how can I start a wave that gets everyone to join and sweep through the whole stadium? If you start the wave alone, it won't work. That's exactly what worries me. If you and a friend try to start a wave together, it still won't work. Another failure, then. Try it with 2 friends, 3 of you, then 4, 5, 6, it still won't work. At some point, you'll have enough people, say 35. Then, on the count of 3, Ola. And it takes off. Beyond that key number, it'll work every time. It's as if there were a real scientific field devoted to this, the science of the tipping point. Studies have examined stadium waves. Early researchers defined the tipping point as the critical number of people needed for an action to be adopted by the whole group. It's fascinating. Anyone who understands and applies the tipping point principle can influence many areas, as the concept holds immense potential. Fortunately or not, it's hard to say. This science is still not fully mastered. Early research focused on stadium waves, a simple phenomenon to observe. Ingenious researchers noted that these collective ripples don't always occur. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. How many people are needed to start a wave? This will serve as a model case to explore the tipping point concept more broadly. It actually takes about 35 people to start a wave. Once enough people join, the group becomes visible enough for neighbors to think, everyone's doing it, I'll join too. Their neighbors follow and the movement takes off. It's fascinating. Up to about 32 participants, almost nothing happens, but once the tipping point is passed, the effect peaks. The curve shows an all-or-nothing effect. There's no in-between. You either have a full wave or none at all. There are other phenomena, especially physical ones, that I often mention because physics offers many fascinating examples. For instance, wildfires also demonstrate a tipping point effect. In other words, tossing a cigarette butt into a forest might sometimes spark a fire, but most of the time nothing happens, much like a stadium wave. In fact, there's a precise heat threshold above which everything can ignite. Below it, nothing happens. This phenomenon also appears in major social contexts, such as revolutions. A tipping point was also seen in the 2010 Arab world movements, later known as the Arab Spring. Similarly, a critical mass of dissatisfied and angry people is emerging. In this case, the required threshold had been greatly exceeded. Once they unite and gather publicly, the movement spreads quickly and sparks broad momentum. Starting a wave takes about 35 people. So all I need is 34 friends to join me at the stadium for a spectacular wave. If we wanted to spark major collective change, I'm glad I don't know how many people it would take. In reality, we're rarely surrounded by 34 people we know. So how do we go from one person to a group of 35? What makes their influence spread? It's a true snowball effect. All 35 must stand up at once. And when a real wave happens, do you mean it's because the threshold's been reached? Exactly. And how do we reach that tipping point of 35 people? That's when context comes into play, making things more complex. Because a specific context, like a football stadium where the game is exciting, the local team is winning, and the crowd is highly enthusiastic, makes things simpler. Spectators may feel like starting a wave, and someone sometimes tries, but it doesn't always catch on. Soon, more spectators feel the excitement and join in, though the attempt still fails. After a while, the tipping point is reached, and the wave finally begins. A broader context shapes the situation. You'll never see a wave during a dull game because the crowd's enthusiasm never reaches the tipping point. Likewise, major change can't occur in a country where everything is going well, since there's neither the context nor the collective awareness needed to reach a transformative tipping point. All right, that's really interesting. Now I know what I need to do to start a wave. A real upheaval is happening, a transformation, perhaps. Let's talk about ants. I love them and find their world utterly fascinating. What's the main misconception about ant organization you'd like to correct today? It's quite simple. Many believe each ant colony has a single queen, slightly larger than the rest. Many people rightly believe the ant queen rules like a monarch, deciding and directing the whole colony. In fact, she isn't a queen in the human sense. She has no authority. Her main role is simply to lay eggs. She's merely the colony's first ant to lay the others, and then stays hidden deep in her nest. Her life isn't exactly exciting. She just spends her days laying eggs and has no real authority. When we think of ants, we often picture a near-monarchic society with a queen making decisions while the others perform their tasks. In reality, it works nothing like that. The system is fully decentralized, each ant acts freely while influencing others, and the queen stays apart, unaware of what happens around her. In fact, she's not a queen in the usual sense. Exactly, we called her a queen, but that's a very human projection. The first researchers saw this large ant in the center and thought, she's bigger. The others seem to protect her. She must be the queen. So we called her a queen, but that label simply reflects our human perspective. She isn't truly a queen at all. What's fascinating about ants is that they have no leader or set plan, yet everything runs flawlessly. Wouldn't this be an ideal model of collective intelligence we could adopt too? In any case, we often use this model in science. Studying ants is fascinating for collective intelligence research, as they provide a highly practical observation model. Most collective intelligence labs keep a small ant farm in the office to run quick, efficient experiments. We take out the ant farm, place the ants in a set situation, and observe their reactions. It works well, but is it perfect? No, sometimes the ants behave inappropriately. Once the system's workings are understood, its mechanisms can be used, for example, to observe their reactions in a tricky situation. For example, ants tend to follow one another, creating amplification effects that help them find food faster or coordinate more effectively when hunting. However, if their arrangement is slightly adjusted with a small tool, they may start circling endlessly, each ant following the one ahead. They will keep circling endlessly until they collapse from exhaustion or lack of food. This behavior may seem completely irrational. In fact, it's simply that a behavioral mechanism normally aiding their food search and survival has been exploited through understanding how it works. In this case, the mechanism can be exploited to create the illusion of a disoriented colony. In fact, terms like intelligent or stupid have little meaning in science. What matters is understanding how the phenomenon works. What mechanism is at work? Once we understand how it operates, we can use it properly or misuse it. Yes, they operate by their own model. Exactly. Could you describe more precisely how they work and divide their tasks? The ants' division of roles is both complex and fascinating. It is a work organization system known as stigmergy. In other words, each person completes what remains to be done in their own way. Thus, some ants temporarily have no specific task to perform. Then some think, since they're hungry, they'll go fetch food and bring it back to the nest. Thus, the ant sets out to find food, and soon the others will no longer need to worry about it. Then they take on new tasks, and over time, they specialize in certain activities. Thus, some ants continually seek food, having become skilled at it. They complete this task faster than the others. Others focus on cleaning, construction, nest upkeep, or caring for larvae, among other duties. This ultimately creates a highly compartmentalized system. In fact, this division of labor gradually developed based on needs. Interestingly, a small group of ants meets the colony's needs while most remain idle. In fact, most ants remain inactive most of the time. Most ants simply stay in the nest, relying on others to feed and clean them. they aren't entirely useless. In times of trouble, these unspecialized ants step in to help. For example, when more food is needed, the unspecialized ants assist the specialists, and so on. The division of labor among ants is fascinating. I find this phenomenon especially intriguing. So, what can ants achieve that we humans cannot? Ants achieve many tasks together, mainly because they lack individualism. Ants always act for their colony's benefit. They consistently act with a strong collective focus, even sacrificing themselves for the colony without emotional involvement. We, by contrast, pour much emotion into such behavior. When an ant spots a predator threatening its colony, even 1,000 times larger, it attacks without hesitation, even at the cost of its life. Without a shred of hesitation. In fact, it's very useful to them, especially when they search for food together. Many ants venture into uncharted areas, risking their lives to check for potential food sources. If they find any, they bring it back to the colony. Otherwise, they return empty-handed. Ultimately, the system works efficiently because individuality is absent. With humans, however, the situation is quite different. We often crave personal reward. If we have to split up to search for something, I'll likely avoid risky or unfamiliar areas. I'd rather just stay quietly here. This, in turn, restricts group exploration and reduces collective performance, among other effects. Thus, the lack of individualism is a major strength of the colony. It is this very unity that gives it power. There is also an absence of ego, as no task is considered subordinate. Everything is carried out collectively, without distinction. Even facing a great predator by pinching its paw isn't seen as a minor task. When action is needed, she steps up without ego, even if it looks like courage. It's vital to look at the whole system, not just the individual. That's exactly what makes it fascinating, utterly captivating. Another creature I deeply cherish and find endlessly captivating is the bee. Have you studied bee behavior? Do they act like ants? I haven't studied bees myself, but I've read several specialized books on them, and it's truly fascinating. It's very similar to ant behavior. They fly, have a queen, and move in coordinated patterns. Ants move in lines, guided by a chemical trail they leave on the ground with their abdomens, called pheromones. Bees can't release pheromones into the air, they communicate through specific dance movements instead. This refers to the bee dance, a specific movement bees use to signal to others that they've found a valuable source. She makes a circular motion to show the direction she wants to go. When other bees see this behavior, they follow her even without knowing the situation. We see behavior much like ants, but in winged insects. Ants and bees operate with remarkable precision. Is there something we humans? There are many examples. I especially value the collaborative approach we use, such as when writing a Wikipedia article. Writing a Wikipedia article works much like an ant colony, though likely not by design. But on closer examination, it turns out to be the same. On Wikipedia, article creation isn't centralized. No one plans or assigns it in advance, yet it takes shape collectively. It's just someone thinking, I'll write an article on this topic, writing part of it, then stopping and moving on. Another person arrives and thinks, oh, someone started an article, I'll add a photo since I have a suitable one. Another person arrives, notices a spelling mistake, and fixes it. Another person adds a new paragraph, and so on. Each person contributes modestly according to their skills and interests. Those who don't want to take part simply stay out of it. No one is required to contribute to Wikipedia, yet a small minority do, gradually building a complete article. In fact, ant colonies work the same way. They work, for example, to build a nest or their own colony. They place a small stone, then another adds one on top. A third ant arrives, notices a pillar, and adds a roof. Another builds a nearby pillar, and so on. This form of cooperation, called stigmergy, works much like what happens on Wikipedia. The resulting structure differs, but the coordination method remains the same. In this respect, the approach draws on ants and proves highly effective. Alright, You mentioned social media earlier, Mehdi, so let's discuss it now. Alright, I'd like to understand what happens when a tweet, post, or video goes viral. It's simply that a tipping point has been reached, the very thing we discussed earlier. In other words, you can post something, a few people share it, then it vanishes. Try again, and the same thing happens, it fades away. But sometimes that content, whether an image, text, video, or something else, is shared widely. Suddenly, it draws attention. The more people see and share it, the faster it spreads. This creates what's known as a viral video or a unique buzz phenomenon. Have you pinpointed the exact number of people at this tipping point? What makes something suddenly go viral? No, I don't have the exact number. It's not that easy to pin down. It depends on the platform. Another factor also comes into play: the recommendation algorithm. A recommendation algorithm is simply software designed to highlight content or products that meet specific criteria. Thus, if the criterion is based on an emotion, such as fear, the algorithm tends to amplify it. For example, in YouTube's early days, the main focus was the number of clicks. So, the algorithm assumed that a video with many clicks should be shown more, which in turn drove even more clicks in a loop. It was a way to promote content deemed interesting. However, users caught on and began creating enticing yet empty content, often paired with flashy images or titles. It's the well-known clickbait phenomenon, also seen in some sensationalist magazines. We quickly realized that an algorithm focused solely on maximizing clicks wasn't effective. It needed a different goal. It then seems platforms shifted toward engagement, favoring content that generated the most comments. Yet again, users notice this and easily exploit it by posting provocative content that sparks strong emotions, prompting comments, interactions, and wider reach. In fact, the situation is more complex. It all depends on which features the algorithm chooses to highlight. It seems algorithms remain somewhat shrouded in secrecy today. On YouTube, for instance, watch time, the length a viewer stays on a video, is highly valued, but can also be strategically manipulated. Simply mention that an exceptional detail will be revealed at the end of the video. Not necessarily at the end, but by announcing that something remarkable will be revealed, you can keep the discussion going for several minutes before actually presenting it. The audience stays attentive for several minutes, not knowing when the special announcement will come. There are always ways to adapt, which is why recommendation algorithms are often kept secret. As a group dynamics expert, do you analyze your YouTube stats to boost performance, grow subscribers, and increase views? I probably do it unconsciously, but it doesn't work well since I don't really understand how YouTube's algorithm works. I aim to create meaningful content that doesn't rely on looks or instant appeal to attract clicks. Yes, because it's still quite a specialized topic. Yes, it's a niche field. The topic is highly specialized, not instantly appealing, but becomes quite engaging once explored. I try to keep some suspense for the viewer and avoid overanalyzing how the video gets recommended at this stage. I figure if the video is good, it should work. Have you noticed any elements we could draw inspiration from? Not really. I've noticed that the videos I'm proudest of are also the ones that perform best. Really? That means they must be stronger in substance. So basically, it's about creating quality content with authenticity, doing it well, and taking pride in what you share online. Ultimately, quality content usually has a good chance of success. That's the interesting part. You don't need to study the algorithm closely. There's always some surprise, and that's part of the game. True, with YouTube, there's always an element of surprise. While reviewing your studies and research, I wondered, does crowd behavior vary by culture? For example, would someone in Japan behave the same way as someone in France? Cultural differences are indeed significant. What fascinates me most is how little cultures differ in certain shared behaviors. For instance, in crowd surges, once density reaches about 6 people per square meter, human behavior is strikingly similar everywhere. However, highlighting cultural differences can also be relevant.
There are many of them.
When discussing pedestrian movement, my first project focused on a cultural difference. It's about which side people choose to pass on when they meet in the street. In some countries, pedestrians naturally step aside to the right, while in others, they favor the left. In France, people tend to move aside to the right, while in Japan or Australia, they do so to the left, a difference that shapes collective behavior. In other words, images of large crowds show that in France people mostly move to the right, while in Japan flows tend to the left. This can cause challenges when organizing international events. For instance, a match between France and Japan may face heavier congestion due to differing movement habits. This is a case of social learning. Individuals grow up within an existing culture, and children naturally imitate their parents' behavior, gradually forming a collective pedestrian preference through imitation and transmission. One also notices a certain sense of discipline among the Japanese, which made me wonder if managing a crowd there might be easier than with a group of French people, for instance. Probably, but I've never noticed any significant difference. In our large-scale crowd studies, this factor seems to matter only marginally. It matters relatively little. Some differences may have existed earlier. However, about 20 years ago, incidents at major religious gatherings often raised concerns about participant discipline. They were often said to move chaotically and lack coordination. In truth, such remarks add nothing constructive, merely blaming a lack of discipline and drawing pointless conclusions. Then we researchers stepped in, implementing logistical improvements and stricter planning, which paid off. Participants kept the same level of discipline, regardless of how organized they were. In the end, its impact was minor compared to the importance of solid infrastructure. What have you learned about human nature from studying? It showed me, as we mentioned earlier, how strongly others can shape our behavior. It's amazing! I hadn't realized how much we rely on the people around us and our social environment for activities, hobbies, taste in movies, style, and even eating habits. Everything seems deeply tied to those around us. Deep down, we're just tiny parts of a whole. Like fish in a school, we often follow those around us. So when someone says, "I'm not influenced at all," it isn't really true. We're all influenceable to some degree, absolutely, completely. Thank you sincerely, Mehdi, for taking the time to answer all my questions. As you know, I have my little ritual. I like to end my interviews with a short round of quick questions. The goal is to get to know you better through fun, unique questions. Ready? Great, let's begin. All right, let's begin. What's the first thing you do when you wake up? What's the last book you read? I reread my own book titled A ton besoin d'un chef. I'm not saying this to promote it, but because I had to reread it, it came out 2 weeks ago, and I've gone through it several times. So it's the last book I read. We'll talk about that a bit later. What belief do you hold that others think is a bit crazy? I'm not sure. I believe in it, even if it's not the best approach. With hard work and persistence, it should eventually succeed. I'm not sure it's a good idea. What luxury could you never give up? Free time and a bit of peaceful solitude. Where do you go to recharge? I especially love the seaside. I live there and never tire of it. If you could invite anyone to lunch, who would you choose? I'd probably choose someone who could teach me a lot, like Jean Cavasai, so I could ask many questions about the climate. Not very exciting. It's costly computer gear, driven by my inner geek. I sometimes splurge on gadgets few people truly see the point of. Your hidden talent? Teaching. Do you believe in a higher power? No. Who inspires you most right now? My children deeply inspire me. What is your greatest fear? I'm not really sure. Few things scare me. What bad habit would you like to break? I don't get enough sleep. My loved ones say my greatest trait is kindness. As for me, what would I call my biggest flaw? Probably naivety. What's the last thing you do before falling asleep? I turn off my phone. Thank you for joining in on the quickfire questions. Let's take a moment for one last question, the signature question of the Manal Show. With all you've learned over the years, what lesson would you share that isn't found in textbooks? Engage in constructive dialogue. Collective intelligence brings people together to solve a shared problem through discussion. Discussions are often ineffective. Some dominate the conversation, others speak too little, some wield too much influence, while others share opinions without being truly heard. In fact, fixing these minor issues is quite simple. If it were up to me, I'd teach the art of effective discussion starting in middle school. What roles foster constructive, effective discussion and sound decision-making? I'm convinced only minor changes are needed for it to work perfectly and make a real impact on society. What a great lesson! I completely share your view. To conclude, as you mentioned, you recently published a book, in October if I'm not mistaken.
Could you tell us a bit about it?
The book is titled Do We Need a Leader? I have several copies here since it was just released and I've just received the shipment from the publisher. With Allery Publishing, right? Yes, exactly, Allery Publishing. It's a short essay on collective intelligence, which is also its subtitle. By presenting various problems to a group of 100 people, we aim to find the most effective way to solve them collectively. Should we start a discussion, hold a vote, or perhaps organize a brainstorming session? We were just talking about it earlier. Why doesn't it work sometimes? Why do groups end up arguing? Where do conflicts come from, and what role does conformity play? Do we really need a leader? This book is definitely on my must-read list for the coming weeks. I'm eager to explore all your work and writings. Many thanks. How can someone contact you to learn more about your work? All details are available on the YouTube channel. A small tab titled Personality or Contact lets you reach me and find more information about my research lab and work. I also have a blog called metamuced.com, though I don't update it very often. As I mentioned earlier, your YouTube channel Philosophy is among the best on the platform. I'll emphasize that again. Thank you so much, Metamuced. I wish you great success in all your future projects. Thank you, madam. Goodbye.